Let's focus for a second on Ukraine and Russia, the big strategic picture. The problem we have here is the continuing bellicosity and constant meddling, even pinprick meddling, is very dangerous in this context. The United States has now announced that the heavy equipment, the tanks and artillery for one brigade armed forces, ground forces, that one heavy brigade is going to be pre-positioned in the Baltic states. This is supreme folly. This is enough to be a provocation. It's certainly not enough to be anything more than a tripwire on the ground. It literally makes no sense. And in response to this idiotic provocation, really more self-destructive than threatening, President Putin of Russia has said, well, if this is the case, we're going to have to increase the number of missiles that we have pointed essentially westward, and that's our compensation. And then looks at the camera and says, really, what are we supposed to do? You're constantly bringing this stuff closer and closer to our borders. We cannot simply ignore it. It's coming on, and it's threatening. So pre-positioning the equipment for one brigade gets you 40 to 50 ballistic missiles. Now, whether those are intercontinental or not, I'm not exactly sure. I think some of these are going to be put into that exclave, from the Russian point of view, the exclave of Kaliningrad, right? This is the old East Prussia. That's Königsberg, Immanuel Kant's city. But that's where the missiles are, because that's the farthest west that the Russian Federation extends. So those are being put into place. Now, let's just look at the undoubted facts of the situation before we go into some interesting speculation about Secretary Kerry and what happened in Sochi, and then what may have happened to Secretary Kerry after that. Let me point out that the people in Europe are paying a lot of attention to the long and detailed interview that Putin gave to the principal Italian daily newspaper, Corriere della Sera. Corriere della Sera has just had a new boss put in. The director, the old director is out, the new director is in. And this interview was conducted on the 6th of June, 2015. So almost 2 weeks ago. And it's continuing to have many implications in the European political situation. Putin says to Corriere della Sera, this is their headline, I am not an aggressor, this is a summary, but I'd like to have a treaty arrangement with Europe, and I've got to have parity with the United States. Okay. Putin goes on to say, we will develop our offensive potential, and we will have to think about systems that can overcome the U.S. anti-missile defense. And he's pointing to the fact that the U.S. denunciation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty has forced him into a logic of meeting these U.S. advances or threats, as he sees them, through corresponding countermeasures on the Russian side. Now, this is interesting because, remember, there's a Russian-Italian special relationship, right? It goes way back, but just in more recent years, right? In the 1960s, the very reactionary Dr. Valletta of Fiat put a large truck plant and automobile plant into southern Russia, right? This is the so-called Fiat Lada, or Lada Fiat 124, also known as the Lada. And you still see those on the roads in Russia, as I noted a couple of weeks ago. So there is a special relation. Now let's see how this special relation is holding up. The relation took in recent years, very recent years, the form of a personal friendship between Putin and Berlusconi. This, as I've stressed repeatedly, this is why Berlusconi was targeted. He was a friend of Putin, and he tended to defend Putin against some of the charges that were being launched against him in the secret councils of the Eurogarchs and Eurocrats, the Brussels gang, and the rest of it. So he had to go. That's why there was a coup d'etat in November 2011. The International Monetary Fund, Monti, Goldman Sachs, all of them involved in ousting Berlusconi. But now let's look at the newspaper that tends to reflect Berlusconi, the one that supported him the most among the main ones. That is Il Giornale. Now, there's no love lost by them on me, right? They have slandered me because of 9/11 and some other things. Okay, fine. So let's just take a look at what's going on more recently. Here's a columnist of Il Giornale, Marcello Foa, and he says Putin is basically right. And he stresses in international relations, you've got to get the big picture, the strategic vision, and then you can actually evaluate the details. So he quotes at some length of his own experience, first of all. He says he's been covering Russia for the past 25 years. And he says, in these 25 years, in effect, I have never, ever had to cover a single international crisis provoked by the Kremlin. No. Instead, what I saw was the progressive and often passive pulling in of the horns by Moscow. In other words, going to smaller scale activities in geostrategy, and at the same time, though, the development of a new Russia starting in 2000, using the increased prices of oil and other natural resources, and that Russia was mainly concerned with trying to gain prosperity. Now, long interview, he wants to quote the following. Putin says, Russia never speaks in conflictual tones, and about we never do that with anybody or about any of these questions. And he says, he cites Prince von Bismarck, right, 150 or 125 years ago. What is important is not the talk, but the potential. And then he says the military expenditures of the United States are superior to the military expenditures of all the rest of the world put together, and those of NATO are 10 times more than the Russian Federation. Russia has practically no military bases abroad. The Russian policy is not global, offensive, or aggressive. You should publish in your newspaper the map of the world showing all the U.S. military bases and ours, and you'll see the difference. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. That's World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. We're just going through this highly interesting interview by Putin to the Italian newspaper Milan Corriere della Sera. That was the 6th of June, and the echoes are continuing here. Il Giornale, different paper, right? More right-wing, more Berlusconi. But nevertheless, the line is, Putin is basically right. This is now a common theme around Europe, and we're going to see how this moves the entire process. Is there reason to fear the Russian bear? Well, Putin says, look at the facts. We haven't been pushing our bases in any direction, and instead NATO has been expanding to the east. We have not been moving in any direction. We have not been expanding in any direction. It's rather the NATO infrastructure that keeps getting closer and closer to us. Corriere then asks Putin, do you deny that there's a threat to NATO? And he says only an insane person, only a lunatic, or someone who's dreaming, right? A somnambulist could imagine that Russia could ever attack NATO. to come forward with this idea has no sense. It's completely baseless. Maybe somebody has an interest in feeding this kind of fear. I can only suppose it. I imagine, he says, I don't think the U.S. wants Russia and Europe to get along well. But anyway, Russia is forced to respond. We don't know what they're doing or why. We know what they're doing, but we may not know why. So we have to respond in these ways. So he says, let me tell you, there's no reason to fear Russia. The world has changed to such a degree that today reasonable people cannot imagine a military conflict on such a vast scale. We have other things to do, other things on our agenda, I guarantee you. And then this Il Giornale center-right Italian commentator says, these are the words of a leader who is not looking for conflict. It is clear, he goes on, that Putin is waiting for nothing more than to be able to close off this crisis with the United States and to get back to being considered an economic partner on the global scale. There is no new imperial Russia. There is a Russia that is attempting to get allowed back in, readmitted to the international community, and to be able to participate once again in the G8. To find a deal solution on Ukraine is not difficult, but you've got to want to find it. And this is the president. And the Corriere has also carried the comments. The former Italian president, Giorgio Napolitano, ex-president now, right, the guy who essentially piloted Berlusconi out of office. Even Napolitano, writes this commentator, even a hardcore Atlanticist, a hardcore NATO backer like Giorgio Napolitano has certified the good faith of Moscow based on what Putin had told him in 2013 and which Napolitano transmitted to Obama, but uselessly. Now, whoever is proceeding with intellectual honesty should rather inquire what are the geostrategic objectives that the United States is surreptitiously and, in my opinion, recklessly, dangerously attempting to obtain. Why did Obama decide to reject the outstretched hand of Putin by threatening new economic sanctions and a missile escalation in Eastern Europe? That is not the way to obtain security for the world. Okay, I think this is a right-wing Italian commentator, and I think this is largely accurate. Now, there was then this question about Sochi, right? I pointed to it that there was this meeting in Sochi, the 6 hours of Secretary of State John Kerry, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and President Putin. And the idea was some kind of a modus vivendi, a way of getting along on questions like Syria, but also Ukraine, Donetsk, the People's Republic, and so forth. And before this was starting, right, there were these headlines. This could be a reset. And so it's about the middle of May. So it's about a month back. And after this, let's see if we can find some good quotes for you here. After this occurred, we had statements from Kerry in particular, telling Poroshenko, right, the madman, the fascist dictator of Ukraine, was told by Kerry to cool it, that somehow an understanding was beginning to emerge, a way out of this crisis, a path towards something better. And Kerry was telling this awful Poroshenko to quit it. And then, however, things got turned around. Now, this was the subject of an appearance by Stephen Cohen, Professor Stephen Cohen, yesterday, I believe. That would be the 18th of June on the Russia Today network, Oksana Boyko, I think. So on the 12th of May, Kerry warned Poroshenko to stop his threats, to stop talking about Crimea, to stop talking about Donbass, and essentially get ready for peaceful solutions. Then, however, we have Victoria Nuland, right? This horrible, odious warmonger witch. She comes out and says, "We reiterate our deep commitment to a single Ukrainian nation, including Crimea and all the other regions of Ukraine." That's Nuland. Now, a real Secretary of State would have fired her the same day. A real president would never have gotten it in there. Speaking at a news conference, so Poroshenko is continuing. He wants Crimea back. Speaking at a news conference on June 5th, Poroshenko says, "Every day and every moment we will do everything to return Crimea to Ukraine. It is important not to give Russia a chance to break the world's pro-Ukrainian coalition." Well, it may be wide, but it's not very deep, Porno. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Needless to say, you're going to find everything that you hear on the program developed in more detail at tarpley.net. Tarpley.net. You'll also find books of mine. By the way, if you want to get some good lines of investigative research, opposition research on Jeb Bush, you got to get that Bush biography of 1992. That's a while ago, but I still had material about Jeb Bush being implicated in Iran-Contra drug running and gun running. And that was when he was the Miami-Dade Republican chairman, and then a little bit later when he was the Secretary of Commerce of the state of Florida. Because remember, George H.W. Bush had two essential machines, right? One is the one he created in Texas, starting from Houston with Tough Tony Farish and the rest of these hacks and operatives. But he also then had, as a good CIA man, George H.W. Bush had that entire political operation. It was essentially the political cover on CIA Miami station, JM Wave. That's all in the Bush biography. So if you don't have it, you better buy it. And all you 20 Republican campaigns out there, Oppo research guys, you want to make your life easy? Go start off with that book of mine, and you'll find all about Jeb Bush and Don Aronow, the gangster, the drug smuggler, how Don Aronow's mysterious death, mysterious murder, somehow helped Jeb Bush to remain unsullied by the kinds of scandals that otherwise were about to come down on his head, and so forth. So, yesterday on this Oksana Boyko, that was again the 18th of June, Stephen Cohen says Sochi came and there were the beginnings of a deal, the first thing being to tell Poroshenko to cool it, but then after Nuland came out with her tirade and her bellicose and Russophobic statement, then the Sochi agreement seemed to fall apart, right? That Sochi really no longer existed, possibly. And who's doing what to whom, right? Is it, some people say Biden, because Biden, of course, Biden has Hunter Biden, right? His son is a speculator and rip-off artist, trying to enrich himself at the expense of the people of Ukraine. We know from the visit that I had with Boris Litvinov that Hunter Biden came in there and said, "I want to buy your coal reserves," and the answer was no. Yet And that's the kind of language that Hunter Biden and the rest of these imperialists simply do not want to hear. They want the bowing and scraping of these characters like Poroshenko or Yatsenyuk or some others. So there's also the question then, what happened to Kerry? A lot of speculation. I wouldn't join in it except to say that there is some opinion that what occurred with Kerry was not so much that he was cycling or that he had a spontaneous bike crash near, I guess, the French-Swiss border as he was there for various talks, but rather that something was done to him. Now, the done to him could mean all sorts of things, right? What kind of an event could put you in the hospital for a couple of weeks, assuming that's that he really was in under doctor's care in a hospital. It could be that somebody made sure that his bike crashed, or it could be that there's more violence involved. Just remember, there are some forces that apparently care very, very much about these sanctions. As soon as you talk about ending the sanctions, there are certain groups that go wild, as Hollande found at the beginning of January when Hollande went on the French radio and said, we've got to end the sanctions against Russia. Well, then look what happened. That's the Charlie Hebdo story, right? That's what occurred. So it's perfectly possible that Secretary Kerry had a bike crash that was assisted as a result of this stuff that he had been saying. Okay? So we can't decide that. If people know something about it, hard facts, that would be highly interesting. But you get the idea. Corriere della Sera has just had a new boss put in. The director, the old director is out. The new director is in. And this interview was conducted on the 6th of June, 2015. So what? Almost 2 weeks ago. And it's continuing to have many implications in the European political situation. Putin says to Corriere della Sera, this is their headline, I am not an aggressor, this is a summary, but I'd like to have positioned in the Baltic states. This is supreme folly. This is enough to be a provocation. It's certainly not enough to be anything more than a tripwire on the ground. It literally makes no sense. And in response to this idiotic provocation, really more self-destructive than threatening, President Putin of Russia has said, well, if this is the case, we're going to have to increase the number of missiles that we have pointed essentially westward, and that's our compensation. And then looks at the camera and says, Federation extends. So those are being put into place. Now, let's just look at the undoubted facts of the situation before we go into some interesting speculation about Secretary Kerry and what happened in Sochi, and then what may have happened to Secretary Kerry after that. Let me point out that the people in Europe are paying a lot of attention to the long and detailed interview that Putin gave to the principal Italian daily newspaper, Corriere della Sera. Let's focus for a second on Ukraine and Russia, the big strategic picture. The problem we have here is the continuing bellicosity and constant meddling, even pinprick meddling, is very dangerous in this context. The United States has now announced that the heavy equipment, the tanks and artillery for one brigade armed forces, ground forces, that one heavy brigade is going to be really, what are we supposed to do? You're constantly bringing this stuff closer and closer to our borders. We cannot simply ignore it. It's coming on and it's threatening. So pre-positioning the equipment for one brigade gets you 40 to 50 ballistic missiles. Now, whether those are intercontinental or not, I'm not exactly sure. I think some of these are going to be put into that exclave, from the Russian point of view, the exclave of Kaliningrad, right? This is the old East Prussia. That's Königsberg, Immanuel Kant's city. But that's where the missiles are, because that's the farthest west that the Russian